All right, let's get started then. Hello and welcome to all of you. I'm very glad that you've had this chance to join myself and Nina and one another today to have this online conversation about environmental destruction and nonviolent action. As we all know, there is a lot going on these two topics all throughout our world, and it is one of the most critically important topics of our time. So before we really dive into this conversation, I want to start this a little differently than I've done other webinars in the past. And I want to just give us a moment to, you can call it prayer, you can call it reflection, you can call it an invoking of the rest of the natural system, the living system that we're going to be talking about today. So I just want you to take a moment to just take a deep breath. And recognize that when you take that breath, you are connecting with the entire biosphere of this earth, that there is no place that you are not interconnected with at this moment as we are on this call. And that to bring up in your mind at this moment all of the things that you love about this earth. Call them present in your heart, in your mind. Think about the ecosystems, the other creatures, the animals, the people you love, and allow them to be present with you as we begin this conversation today. It's not an abstract topic, is it? So my name is Rivera Sun. I'm an author and an activist. I am also a trainer in nonviolent struggle. So that means that I go around and I teach strategy for movements, and I advise movements who are looking to use wise strategies. I work for Campaign Nonviolence as a trainer, and I am delighted to be collaborating with Towards a Nonviolent World and with SVAG, Society for Nonviolent Action. And I'd like to invite Nina to speak a little bit about those two organizations, which are based in the Netherlands, and why they were so interested in collaborating with activists in the US and activists outside of the US to present a series of workshops, and in particular this conversation today. Nina.
Yeah, good morning and welcome to everyone. So I am working with this organization called the Foundation for Active Nonviolence, and they do a project which is called Towards a Nonviolent World, and this is training for youth workers across Europe and also some neighboring countries. And so in Europe, nonviolence definitely doesn't get the same attention as it has in the US. And I think mainly because here everyone learns about Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, and we don't have like an icon as Martin Luther King. So the word nonviolence is really much less discussed, especially after the Cold War ended. So the organization I work with actually exists already for 50 years. And in the beginning it was very active because they were organizing people for consensus rejection. And now that the military is voluntary, and as I said, with this difficulty to understand the word nonviolence even, times are a bit different. So we wanted to connect to people in the US to kind of facilitate more dialogue and learn from each other. And well, we chose different topics. So this one, I think, is one that is very urgent and also a topic that many people are concerned about. So we will hear more from you, hopefully, what your particular concerns are, because it's a huge topic, of course.
Thank you, Nina. We are going to structure this call as a dialogue, so I hope you came prepared to share and to speak as well as to listen and to hear. It's really a topic that is global. It's not just something happening in our backyard, but it is something happening in our backyard. And what we'd like to do is I'm going to do a little presentation on just some of the different types of strategies that have been used around this issue to frame the expanse of what we'll be looking at today. And then we're going to turn it back to you guys. We're going to invite you to share ideas about and stories of what is going on near you. We're going to let you talk about what is most inspiring in the field of nonviolent action in this work. We're going to really let you talk with one another and with us about what you think could also be done or be done more of. As you know, we enter this critical time period. We know that to work on this issue, we have a pretty limited time scope to work on it if we, as humans, want to actually continue to do the living, breathing work of change making and creation on this planet. So let me just do a quick check-in to see if there are any questions from anyone before we start. You can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself and ask. Great, wonderful. So I'm going to do a little screen share and just walk us through some of the different ways that people have actually worked for change on this issue. So first of all, I want to just define nonviolent action. Now, nonviolence is this word that actually is enormous. We could go on for 10 hours about what nonviolence is. But nonviolent action is a specific thing within a specific context. And I want to just define it a little bit for the context of this conversation. So nonviolent action is a set of tools and methods for creating social change. And all right, I can hear whoever is not on mute, just so you know that that's coming through. So nonviolent action is a set of tools and methods for creating social change that are nonviolent. For the purposes of this conversation, they're also, they are not property destruction or sabotage. That is a big topic of discussion, but for today, I'm going to just frame a parameter of what is nonviolent action to be on the other side of that conversation. We can have that another time. What nonviolent action is a set of tools that includes over 198, and it's actually much larger than that particular categorized list of methods. These can include the things that we think of: protests, demonstrations, marches, but also boycotts, strikes, shutdowns, blockades, occupations, non-cooperation, civil disobedience, and much, much more. We'll talk more about those types of action as we get into today's conversation. It's certainly not passivity, it's not violence, and it's also not simply calling your senators or petitions on an issue. It's much broader than that. So one thing I like to tell people about nonviolent action is that it is a global lineage. It is a global phenomenon. It is something that we as human beings have created together. It's actually quite old, and it's on a huge escalation curve of being used in coming out of the 20th century and moving into the 21st century. That we are at a time when nonviolent action is sweeping the globe. People are becoming more and more adept at it, and we are using it on a very broad range of issues. It has been demonstrated to be twice as effective as violent methods. So that's good news. So here's the not so great news. Environmental destruction. I am going to just take a moment and put you guys on mute for a moment, just so we have a little bit of feedback. And I want to make sure that we don't have that. Okay, let's go into nonviolent action. All right, so environmental destruction is not a new problem. It goes back hundreds and thousands of years, and nonviolent action to respond to environmental destruction also goes back that long. One of the earlier examples that we have of nonviolent action for environmental protection occurred in 1730 in India, when the original tree huggers, who were the Bishnoi religious sect, a group of women threw their arms around trees that were slated to be chopped down by a king. Now they were actually massacred, but their sacrifice inspired the king to protect the forest. This story later inspired the Chipko movement of the 1970s in India, in which, again, people did that. They threw their arms around trees to protect them from logging. They were successful. As we know, that term leaped continents and showed up as tree huggers here in the US, leading to things like Julia Butterfly Hill's famous tree sit in Luna to protect the Redwood forest. Now, environmental destruction doesn't just include deforestation, but also climate change, as we now know, ocean acidification, desertification, pollution, toxicity, oil spills, species loss, habitat loss, topsoil degradation, ecosystem destruction, and much, much more. So the field of types of campaigns responding to environmental destruction is really quite large. So maybe as you're sitting there looking at this list on the screen, take a moment to think about campaigns that you might know or might have been a part of on these various issues and the types of nonviolent actions that people might have used in relationship to them. So we know that acts of protest and persuasion, marches, demonstrations, visibility actions, street theater, signs, banners, write-ins, letters to the editor are very commonly used around these issues. Those are just actually one type of nonviolent action, and they're one category. It's a very large and expansive creative category, but the list goes on. And constructive programs are a type of nonviolent action that we actually almost often forget about in dealing with an issue or problem that we face. But in the arena of environmental destruction, it's actually quite a broad category. These include constructive actions such as renewable energy or localism or bike to work programs or recycling programs. It includes things like habitat restoration, such as the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, which was a major deforestation, anti-deforestation campaign and movement that was completely successful. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Transition towns could be termed a constructive program, which is a constructive program itself is a phrase that Gandhi invented to kind of counter the type of nonviolent action that we know that stops harm from happening, which we could call obstructive program. So these are happening all over the place in almost every community that we know. There's some small or large scale constructive action to address it and change and transform environmental destruction. So you see, I bring this up because we often forget these are happening, and yet they are some of the most heartening forms of things that we can do. Another type of nonviolent action that is particularly important to emphasize in this particular conversation is divestment. Is getting colleges, banks, retirement funds, individuals, charitable endowments, and also industries to divest from the harmful causes, in this case, as you see on the screen, of climate change, and preferably reinvest that money in actually the systems that are going to replace and transform the problem we're facing. So divesting from fossil fuels and investing in renewable energies. The divestment campaigns around fossil fuels have been very successful, and they continue. And as we'll see later on, you know, the divest from the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is a struggle happening here in the US, has been a very rigorous way for people who cannot go to Standing Rock in North Dakota to support that movement. I believe there is something like over $53 million that have been moved out of the corporate banks that are financing the Dakota Access Pipeline. Divestment also played a very important role in stopping mountaintop removal in multiple series of the long 30-year campaigns to stop coal mining through blowing up mountains. Creative legal challenges have also been a powerful form of nonviolent action around environmental destruction. This image is of the Our Children's Trust campaign, which uses a little-known part of US legal law called our public trust to say that the states and the federal government have a responsibility to protect the environment as part of the trust we hold for the future generations. And they are being successful at this time. The lawsuits continue. They're going up through the court system at this moment. So blockadia is a term that Naomi Klein popularized. She didn't invent it, but she did popularize it. And it refers to a set of nonviolent actions that have been used to block pipelines, fossil fuel infrastructure projects, liquid natural gas export terminals that use the actual tactic of a blockade to stop construction on new infrastructure. This has been very successful and very widespread. This is happening right now in dozens of communities throughout the US. Very important to know about. So I just want to highlight some of these major fossil fuel struggles that also have fallen underneath the kind of arena of the kind of blockadia, which is actually, it's a global thing, but I'm going to talk largely about the cases that I know, which are in the United States. This includes the Shell No campaign, pictured in this photo, where kayaktivists got in kayaks and famously in Portland hung off of a bridge to block this oil rig that you see in the photo from leaving the Pacific Northwest and traveling up the coast to the Arctic where it was supposed to drill for oil. This campaign was successful, and the Shell Oil Company pulled out of drilling in the Arctic. They cited industry and financial reasons. It's a common thing that will happen when actually we as activists have used nonviolent actions strategically to capitalize on low downturns of fossil fuel markets, to actually raise the stakes on those projects so that they're no longer affordable. Other projects include the Standing Rock No DAPL resistance in North Dakota, the KXL pipeline resistance, which was successful for many years and is now in a second round of having to activate and stop the the monstrous pipeline from returning. Liquid natural gas terminal resistance on the west and east coast. On the west coast, they have stopped successfully 6 of the natural gas terminals that were slated. The campaign to stop Spectra, which is an oil and gas company that has multiple pipelines throughout the US that are being resisted. And resistance to FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which was a rubber stamping agency, which this year actually, for the first time in its history, denied a permit to an oil and gas project. As we've mentioned before, the campaigns to stop mountaintop removal have also been successful to small and large degrees. Some of them were blockades. Others used a variety of other tactics, and some that were successful recently include the effort to get PNC Bank, the major financier of mountaintop removal, to stop financing that through a divestment struggle. We often forget in this work, because the challenges are so large and there are so many front lines, how often we are successful. And I feel like that's one thing to remember, that we feel like we're failing all the time, but we actually are succeeding quite often. And to remember those stories, because they give us lessons and they give us hope. This is just one little type of civil disobedience and nonviolent action that I want to just highlight. This is Tim DeChristopher, a US climate activist who was called Bidder 70 because he walked into an oil and gas lease auction and started bidding on the oil and gas leases, and actually ended up winning them, but had absolutely no intention or money to buy those leases. There have been a variety of variations on this, both buying up leases but not drilling, and also disrupting oil and gas lease auctions. He was sentenced to prison and for 2 years, and is now out and is organizing more climate disobedience, as he calls it. A great example of a strategic nonviolent action. I want to just highlight this other case in Quebec, because it is one of my most favorite stories of resistance to environmental destruction. So the villages in Quebec were facing fracking coming into their area, and they found out because the fracking trucks were in their backyard. They organized a campaign that was very strategic and multi-pronged. There was part of the campaign worked on getting a moratorium on fracking, a ban. Another worked on raising awareness through a march and through theater and through public rallies and talks and lectures. And that branch also worked on preparing a plan of strategic nonviolent action that could be used as a deterrent to the industry. So what they did was they laid out a map of the area, and they said, if the frackers come here, we will use these types of nonviolent action to block these roads, to stop them from accessing these water sources, to halt their equipment here, and the list went on. And then they wrote it all up. And then they started training all the villagers as if you would train a nonviolent army to be able to carry this out. And then they got even more savvy, because the industry told them that every time they lost a day of putting in an operation, it costs the fracking industry $500,000. So then they did the math, and they showed how much money they would cost the investors if they tried to come in and drill in Quebec. And then they publicized it. They did a whole media campaign around getting the news of this plan of resistance and how much it would cost that company and the investors in that company to those investors. And for 11 years, the strategy stopped fracking in Quebec. And a couple of years ago, they had a resurgence of the interest in fracking in the shale region of Quebec, which is very strong. Now, Schist 911 is shale 911. I could say that in French, like a schist 911. Maybe you'd say once. But what that is an emergency number that they set up in their community. So if anyone saw a fracking truck, or anyone heard that they were coming back, or anyone's door got knocked on with someone wanting to sign a lease on their oil and gas underneath their farmhouse, they would call that number, and that would activate the entire local network and call them together, and they could use it in rapid response for blockading roads, all kinds of things. So it's a brilliant strategy, and I always like to talk about it because it's something we all could do right now in our communities. There's no need to wait on this strategy. We could do it on fracking, oil and gas pipelines. We could do it about the inability or the refusal of our utilities to switch to renewable energy. This idea of preparing a plan and using the plan in advance of actually doing the actions to leverage for change can be done anywhere. And again, this is Wangari Maathai and the Greenbelt movement of Kenya. This is just a powerful story of deforestation and the way that it related to other issues such as lack of democracy, erosion of culture and values, gender imbalances, loss of land, corruption, and how they had to work on the intersectional issues in order to work on climate issues, work on actually rebuilding the forest. And so I bring it up as a reminder that our issues are all connected. And if we're going to work on climate issues, we have to also work on democracy. We have to work on culture. We have to work on all of the issues that surround that. Inequality, racism, sexism, it's all in there. So one thing that didn't come up in the slides that is worth mentioning is that lifestyle activism counts under constructive action. Now, lifestyle activism includes aligning your own personal life and the life of your businesses in sustainable ways, but lifestyle activism has a little negative effect, which is that we keep it personal. We do it for ourselves, but we forget to ask our friends to do it. And we certainly sometimes forget to organize campaigns in our neighborhoods and communities to say, I'm going to bike to work today. I wonder how many people I could also get to bike to work. Let me start a campaign to see if I can get that to happen more. So we forget to do the multiplier effect of collective action in connection to the personal shifts and choices we are making in our own lives. So that would be an example of something we could do a little bit better as we go on, and we will need to do. There's something on this list I also want to mention, which is reducing meat consumption. That we talk a lot about fossil fuels, we talk a lot about conservation, we talk a lot about protecting ecosystems or species. But one other really important thing to understand is that animal meat consumption accounts for 17 on the low end of this number to 51% of all the greenhouse gases emitted. So, you know, you could take it on the small end of the spectrum and say 17% is not too small. And reducing our meat consumption is something that actually we can all do in our lives right away, immediately, today. No one's going to tear gas us. No one's going to arrest us. It's actually not that challenging an economic challenge to do. You know, we all have joked about the beans and rice diet for decades. So on the high end of that calculation, it could be up to 51% of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a sobering thing to reflect on, that perhaps 50% of this problem, half of this problem, is something that we as people could actually address without much pain and suffering. I always say reducing meat consumption, you could eliminate it altogether, but it's a personal choice. It matters to one's health and how you view your diet. So I like to frame it as a choice and that there are different options in there. So I'm going to stop there because that was enough to frame this conversation. We have lots of new people who have joined us on the call, and I want to welcome you. And I also just want us to take a moment to just breathe and absorb that. It's a lot of information. And I chose those stories to just give us a sense that there are a lot of ways to address environmental destruction, a lot of different tactics, a lot of different strategies, and that the situation is not hopeless. There are places specifically that we can work to expand and improve what our communities are doing. And that those places are often very localized as well, which is, for many of us, very heartening, since we do see the political stalemate at the higher levels of government and at the international level, largely because of the US. I want to take a little US credit for that stalemate at the international level. All right. So I want to just invite Nina to come back on. She's going to do a first sort of warm-up question to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Rivera, for this introduction. We wanted to know, on a scale from 1 to 5, how much of a problem that you think that the natural destruction is, and what is the topic that you're most concerned about?
So there are a couple of ways to respond to this. If you are on video, you can, raise a finger 1 to 5 to show it. If you are on mute, or if you are on telephone, if you have your video turned off or you're on telephone, you can also raise your hand that you want to speak. All right, so 5 from Nathan, 5 from Durrell, 5 from Helen, 5 from Dan on the chat box. That's another way you could respond. All right. So I'm going to invite our 2 people who are on the telephone. I just unmuted you. If you were trying to respond earlier, we didn't hear you. Okay, no response. That's okay. So for everyone who did respond, which was many of us, this is a critical issue. So we'd like to thank you, Durrell, for sharing that Fukushima is your biggest concern. That is also a very poignant and frightening example of environmental destruction. What we'd like to invite you to share, opening this conversation, are some of your favorite stories of nonviolent action in stopping environmental destruction. What are some examples that inspire you?
May I share a situation that actually I, excuse me, my voice is a little raspy this morning. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the wolf reintroduction program in the Gila National Forest. The Mexican gray wolf was an endangered species. And when I first moved here, there was quite a number of people that were up in arms about the fact that the wolf was being reintroduced. Because there's a lot of ranching here, and the ranchers felt that reintroducing the wolf was critically hampering their ability to raise livestock, which they had a legitimate concern. But they were quite up in arms about it, and excuse me, being and getting a little bit violent about it from time to time. So there was a lot of controversy, and I really was not that aware of it until I moved here, and I could feel the energy was really like ramping up. And at that time, I was not married to a rancher. I am now, but I have practiced shamanism for a number of years and not really realizing what I was getting myself into. There was a wolf rally one day where all the ranchers were gathering, and there was probably about 50 or 60 men, and they had invited a lot of the legislators to the meeting, and they were really getting each other all excited and angry about it. And so I just took my drum, and when they started the meeting, I just began playing my drum, which was quite a crazy thing for me to do, but I didn't. I was sort of in an altered state, I guess. But I will say this, it quieted that crowd down quite effectively, and because they didn't know what I was doing, they didn't realize why I was there, and their focus went completely off of what they were angry about to trying to figure out what I was doing. And from that time on, their energy level it completely shifted. And I realized, not really going into it what I was doing, but the effect that can have. And then yesterday I was reading in the paper, they had a Ku Klux Klan meeting somewhere here in the United States. And some man, he took his tuba and started marching along with the Ku Klux Klan and playing his tuba. And it completely shifted the energy to him instead of what they were marching about. So those kinds of things they're quite effective. And but I will say this, that takes some courage. You have to be willing to take responsibility for your actions.
Thank you, Darrell. It's a pair of really great stories, and also a really good example of the way that we can activate active nonviolence as individuals in courageous ways to change and transform the situations that we're facing. And the field of nonviolence, as we know, is just full of those kind of stories, and we need to really celebrate them and lift them up. So thank you for sharing that. Dan, thank you also for mentioning Standing Rock and the valve turners. Do you want to say more about the valve turners? Because that is a really great story. Maybe you don't want to get on microphone right now, but if you do, that would be a wonderful thing to share. Oh, no mic today. Okay. So I don't know the story very well, but I will do my best to synopsis, and if I get something terribly wrong, you can correct me in the chat box and I won't take it personally. But the valve turners was a fairly recent example of a set of activists who actually went to the oil pipelines and turned them off. They had gotten training in actually how to do this safely so you don't cause explosions or oil leaks, and they went and they turned off the oil pipes, and then some of them locked down to them as they shut off. This actually has a precedent story that I know better than this one, which happened in Nigeria, that Nigerian women were protesting Chevron oil, and they actually occupied the oil production facility very successfully. And then they also, after that campaign to get them to Chevron to follow up on the demands they had conceded to, they all over Nigeria, people went and they actually turned off the valves on the pipelines, and they refused to turn them back on until the oil company actually followed through on the demands that they had actually agreed to meet. So yeah. And I am going to track down more about the valve turners because I caught them as they happened here in the US, but I'm not remembering the details well enough. But thank you. Who else has a story you would like to share? Could be something that you yourself have done or something that you have heard about in the news. For example, a story that I really like happened in the next county over here in New Mexico, where they were facing fracking coming in, and so they passed a community rights ordinance that asserted that nature had rights and the community had rights equal to, but not above or below, the state and federal rights and corporate rights. They actually revoked corporate rights, I believe, in passing this ordinance. And it was a revolutionary document. It protected the right of the people to use civil disobedience and nonviolent action to uphold the community ordinance. And it exempted the police from enforcing laws in relation to operations that violated the rights of nature. It's very, very powerful. Imagine if there had been such a thing in Mandan, North Dakota, for example. There might have been a different situation. The police might have been like, oh yeah, let's go arrest water protectors, why not? But I like the story of Mora because Mora is actually it's currently the second poorest county in the nation. It's extremely rural, it's very small, and they were the first county in the country to actually pass one of these community rights ordinances. And it did stop the oil and gas company for about 2 years before the legal challenges overturned it, and they are now at work on other strategies. There is currently no fracking happening in Mora. Nina, let's hear from you.
Well, I was thinking about the No Shell campaign that you mentioned, because I think that started when the Obama administration gave permission to actually drill in the Arctic. And at the same time, Greenpeace held this campaign that was kind of a hoax campaign. So Shell had this campaign with the slogan, "Let's go." So they made all these posters, and I think even like a little clip that was saying like a phrase that activists could actually, or anyone really could send in a phrase and then let's go. So one thing that I found really funny, like the polar bear is of course a symbol of the Arctic. And so they had something like, black is the new white with the polar bear, and then let's go. And so it confused people a lot. So that's like a funny way to get the attention and make a good point. And then I was wanting to share that I've been involved with a campaign against what we call blood coals, similar to blood diamonds. So this is in the north of Colombia, where two very big companies are mining. And these companies are actually complicit with human rights violations. So there are different armed groups in Colombia, and they use those groups to crack union movements and to remove people from the land that they wanted to excavate. So it's still an ongoing thing. And in general, by the way, there is a lot of resistance in South America against very big companies, especially in mining. So if you want to hear more stories, there's lots to find on the internet.
Thank you, Nina. I think one thing to really keep in mind is that resistance is fertile. It's everywhere. But one particular strand of environmental action that needs to be really kept in the forefront of our mind is the role of Indigenous communities in this work, that they have been the leaders in this field for hundreds of years, literally, but especially in recent decades, and that now we're actually at a turning point where people are recognizing that more and more. So I just wanted to bring that up, and I could tell a story about that, but I also want to just check around and see if there's other stories that want to be shared and told at this moment. Our friends on telephone, you're going to have to speak up because I don't have any hands for you. Can't see you waving your hand. All right, so before I tell this quick story, I'm going to put a bunch of links in the chat box to things that we've talked about on this call. There are far more links, but you'll have to go and look them up. Helen, let's hear from you. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
We can, thank you.
Okay. So the story I thought of, it was something, I don't know if people are familiar with the Yes Men. They're a team of two guys who pull all kinds of stunts, against corporate power and government chicanery and such. And often what they do is quite funny. But the one that I'm thinking of now, I saw it portrayed in a movie they made. It involved the Bhopal disaster in India, I think maybe from the 1980s. It happened many years ago. But the American company Union Carbide was responsible for dumping tons and tons of chemicals in this town in India called Bhopal. And they never took responsibility, never cleaned up, never paid reparations to the people who were killed or poisoned by these chemicals. So what the Yes Men did, one of them dressed up as was like impersonated a spokesman for Union Carbide and went on a television show on the BBC and issued a statement supposedly on behalf of Union Carbide saying, all these years have passed and we finally decided to take responsibility for what we did in Bhopal, and we're going to, clean up, and we're going to pay for the medical care for the people who died and pay money to their families, and we're going to take responsibility for this. So for a short while, of course, people believed that this was true and were kind of, shocked and, in some cases happy, in other cases just dumbfounded. And then what happened was that an actual Union Carbide, or I think by that time had been absorbed in the Dow Chemical, an actual spokesman for the company then had to go on TV and say this is not true, say we're not going to take responsibility, we're not going to pay for medical care for the people who were injured by our actions. We're not going to do any of this stuff. So I don't know what ended up happening after that. If I don't know if the only real outcome was just sort of exposing the hypocrisy, or if anything materially changed for the people of Bhopal. I actually don't know. But I just remember that story of at least, forcing some truth to come out.
Rivera, you're muted, I think.
Yeah, thanks. So thank you, Helen. I was just saying, wow, thank you for sharing that story. Such a great story, and the Yes Men are wonderful to check out. You should watch their documentaries. There's 2 of them, I think. And they have done a number of stunts around environmental issues, and many of them actually have caused some action to happen on the other end. So I love that you brought that up, Helen. Thank you so much. So I just want to bring up a couple stories. One is just to recognize Ireland, the country, for divesting from fossil fuels. And Dan is pointing out simultaneously that Chico State University, or California, it's the University of California, Chico, divested from oil. It was the first one in the divestment campaigns. And also just recently, Seattle divested from the banks financing the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is a very big account, the city of Seattle. Portland, Oregon has not only divested from fossil fuels, they've also passed a resolution to actually actively oppose as a city any fossil fuel development infrastructure that is seeking to come through the city. That's major. I mean, it's a huge like port shipping city thing. So very, very good. Also, a little story that most people don't know, but Jenny Ladd, who was one of the heirs of, gosh, I think Standard Oil. I could have the wrong oil company, but I think Standard Oil took her inheritance, her whole inheritance, and divested it from fossil fuels, which is like saying to your family, no more, and reinvested it in renewable energy. That's profound. There's a tremendous amount of assets or companies representing billions and trillions of assets worldwide that are divesting from fossil fuel infrastructure, including the Royal Dutch Bank, I believe. Nina, you probably know more about this than me, but this was some years ago. They actually said we will no longer finance mining and extraction projects. And this was the reason they stated, because the risk factor due to the political climate, meaning us activists, has increased too high to make it a safe investment anymore. So I want to also let Nina open up the next question in this conversation. And those of you who have been listening more, maybe this is a question that might connect with you and you might want to speak up and share a little bit. But Nina, over to you.
Yeah, well, actually, I wanted to mention, you reminded me of the Urgenda, we say in Dutch, which is a group that actually sued the Dutch state for not financing renewable energies enough, and they won the case. So they pressured the Dutch government successfully to invest more in renewable energies. Yeah, and then so unless people still want to talk a little bit about movements that they are involved in, we wanted to hear a little bit more of what else you think is needed and what else can be done to face this environmental crisis that we are in.
So when we're looking around at our communities, at what is going on in our communities, maybe we could do this in two ways. We can share a little bit about what we ourselves are doing, movements or campaigns that we are connected to, what we see happening in our communities that's good and positive, and then what else needs to be done. Maybe it's something in a movement or a campaign that you're a part of that is looking for more participation from society. Maybe it's something that you see in the broader field of climate action or environmental protection action that is going to need a little attention, and you have an idea about how to actually do that. Well, don't all jump at once.
I can jump in here about things I'm personally experiencing. This is Nathan here.
Great, go ahead.
I think I live in a place that is somewhat progressive at San Francisco and some of these things, and I'm always trying to figure out how to stay involved locally. So I'm always looking for kind of what's the local way to get involved in what you're doing, no matter where you live. And so that's one thing that I wish there was, and I know I need to continue to investigate, and that's part of why I'm on this call, but I'm always interested in kind of how to find good ways to connect locally to what you're doing. So what needs to get done in the nonviolent space.
Great, thank you, Nathan. Appreciate hearing that. And there are always more things, aren't there? But I think one of the things to bring to mind is really that if we can name them, if we can see them, that is the first step in knowing what to do about them. And so we often wait for, big leaders or government, big organizations to say, that's a problem, let's do something about it. But the story that we hear from inside movements and campaigns is that very ordinary people, just like us, looked around and said, oh, that needs to be done. Why don't I work on that piece of the puzzle? And we know that many of the strategies around climate change and around environmental protection are not enough on their own. We're talking about an interconnected web of life that includes all 7.2 billion people and the entire natural ecosystem, right? So there's many things that we ourselves can't do on our own to fix all the problems, but we might be able to hold down one piece of the puzzle. And just, these could be small things. I spoke with a woman who was into wild backyard gardening outside of Chicago, and she started encouraging her neighbors to plant local wild species instead of, their lawns in suburbia, which is actually quite urban where she is now. But what happened was that when they started planting these, I don't even know the names of them, but bushes and shrubs that grow in the local area, birds started coming back, and bees and butterflies and aviatory species. And all of a sudden, these two wildlife refuges on either side of their urban area had a corridor. But what that meant was that an entire migratory route from Canada to Mexico had just been reconnected along the Great Lakes through this urban area. That's inspiring to me, that kind of story, that we can do that kind of restorative work, and that it really can happen in one backyard at a time. What else? What other stories do you know?
I'll jump in one more time, which is to say, one story that I thought was really exciting was around the Marshall Islands. I don't know if you guys have heard about them too much, but they're going to have to all leave in 20 or 30 years. And the daughter of the, I think, prime minister there or somebody sort of became an activist and protested against the way that that her father, I guess, was sort of doing policy. I don't know all the details, but I thought it was very inspiring that she kind of stood up against the sort of ruler there.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. When we look at the displacement because of climate, it's both global, and of course we have these low-lying island nations that are going underwater from rising sea levels. This is happening not just in the Marshall Islands or in the island chains, but also like right off the coast of the south of the US, and affecting indigenous peoples and tribal nations here in this area as well. Every single area has a different problem that we're facing. For instance, in New Mexico, it's projected that in 17 to 35 years, 90% of our trees in our forests are going to be gone, largely from drought and fire. We know throughout the Rockies just north of us going up through Colorado that many of those forests are standing dead right now. And so the work is both very localized and very globalized. And we do know that everything matters to this equation. Some of the places that I see that we can be doing more work is around building these campaigns that take some of our personal choices into shared projects in our communities or even nationwide. So starting initiatives around a shift that you personally are making. Don't go it alone. Go with friends. Find support networks. For instance, my family farm is working on going renewable this year. It's not easy. It's a boggling maze of financing and credits and things we can't really afford, but we know we need to do it. And do we do energy conservation, or do we do solar, or do we do wind, or what is actually renewable and sustainable in that area? but there are people who know these things, and connecting with them and forming affinity groups to do some of these changes can be a very powerful form. And that's something that Transition Town has also done very well, is connecting people around making these shifts. What else? What do you see? What are some of your concerns that are looming? Because maybe if you share a concern, someone else might know a strategy.
I have a concern, kind of on a social level. I used to live in New York City. I grew up there, and I lived there till recently. And I had the experience of, of course, in this city of millions of people, not having a sort of conventional job or school or, organized life. I just had the experience of being very isolated and very lonely. And now I live in a much smaller place, but the experience is kind of similar. In the past year, I spent some time, a couple months, maybe two periods of 2 months each, at an eco-village in North Carolina, where there is no cell service and there is limited wireless internet. So the place where I was staying, a collective house, there was no wireless internet there. And the internet was slow if you were going to use it with your Ethernet cable. And the atmosphere in that place, do a lot of things, but I particularly noticed the absence of screens. The atmosphere was so incredibly different. After I left and came back to New York, I kept thinking about this and just the difference in how I felt in the two different places. And I came up with the idea of social nourishment versus social malnourishment or social starvation. And what I experience in my city life is just isolation and disconnection, which has a lot to do with the prevalence of the screen, and how that is taking over. It's like I'm on a screen right now. I acknowledge that, and I am not saying it is entirely disconnecting, but it's kind of a substitute connection, it seems to me. And another really major thing that I experienced at Eco-Village is just social porosity. That like it was easy to run into people outside your immediate, family unit all the time. And of course, in my city life, I'm always having to make an appointment. You don't just run into people for the most part. That to me, the prevalence of screens, the unquestioning acceptance of new technologies that start out as optional and then become mandatory, that are supposed to connect but then do the opposite. That is a concern.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Helen. Does anyone want to respond to that?
I'll jump in if no one else wants to.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's really interesting to think about the role of technology in all of this and how it both allows us to do a call like this, but also can bring us all apart. And seems like despite whatever we all would like, it's growing at an increasing rate. So I think that's you made me think about this idea of how much time you should spend on screens and digitally connecting with people versus how much you spend in person. And in my community, I know I've tried to say I still don't know as many of my neighbors as I'd like to, and tried to put a meetup together. And I think that's like a interesting idea, is how do you find ways to connect to just the people who are really close to you in your different environments, and also how do you then make it a nice connection? I know some people would kind of feel like they get too much of their neighbors sometimes.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan, for speaking up. And Darrell, do you want to chime in? I hear your birds
Yes.
speaking. It's hard for people to hear you, just so you know, with the birds.
Yeah, I can't. It's really hard. I can't shut them up. They're quite vocal, especially when people are talking. They like to be a part of it. This subject is something I've been discussing with another group, the Depth Psychology Alliance, and how technology is invading our space. And I think the key is balance, as the person was just saying before us. Most everything on our planet has a symbiotic relationship, and it's just trying to figure out ways, I think, that we can be symbiotic with technology, finding the good and recognizing the evil, I guess, if you want to use those terms. But we can't throw the baby out with the bath, because I really feel that right now, particularly in our political climate in this country, technology may be a way of keeping people off the streets. There's quite a lot of concern about our political situation, and it's allowing people to converse and share ideas without, I mean, they may be angry, but they're not acting it out. And so there's just good and bad about it. And I do share your concern too, but I think if we just keep balance in mind, we'll be okay.
Thank you, Darrell. So some thoughts to relate this theme to nonviolent action and environmental protection specifically, which is, it's very much related. First of all, one of the reasons I shared the slide about the Greenbelt movement in Kenya is that their environmental destruction was deeply tied to the breakdown of their social and cultural connections through colonialism and the ensuing period thereafter. We too have that problem here in the US. So what we experience in isolation, separation, atomization is a cultural framework that has been created, crafted, and shoved down the throats of the American people because it made us good workers and consumers. It's not good at all for being human. There's nothing about that way of life that is actually has any basis in historically how the human being evolved. And so again and again, we find in nonviolent struggle that this component of breaking down isolation and rebuilding connections is actually key. It's key not only for the first struggle, the first issue that we come up against it in, it's key for resolving all kinds of issues and struggles in our communities. And that one of the phenomenons of nonviolent struggle is that once it's occurred, it is more likely to occur. Whether it failed or succeeded the first time, it's more likely to happen again. And one of the reasons for that, there are many, is because those bonds of social connection start to be reformed. And we start to realize that, we don't like living in these little boxes. We're social beings. We like to relate. In terms of the big environmental crisis that we face, one of the trends that is happening with the help of nonviolent action, and especially those constructive programs, is that we are turning our gazes back to where we are, the localism of where we are. And we're saying we can't escape dealing with this anymore. We can't just pretend we're part of a global society, but not part of our neighborhood. And people are starting to make particular choices around that. They're either moving and finding new neighborhoods, or they're digging deep roots and doing transformative work in their neighborhoods. Because a lot of our neighborhoods or towns or local communities are suffering in many ways. And so when we turn back and we see that suffering, we often engage numerous forms of nonviolent action, including the constructive actions of bringing people together, the educational actions, and also the acts of protest and persuasion, which are about waking up, raising awareness, bringing people's collective attention together, and then those deeper forms of non-cooperation or intervention, if need be. Nathan, you also mentioned this time with the digital versus the digital world, which is important, like we're learning a lot together today, or our local community. But there's really a third part of this equation, which is very important, and that is the earth itself, right? So we tend to get caught in these little human-centric worlds and forget the earth. And so as part of the practice, the actual action that we do to go to our local park if we're urban, or the urban garden, or some urban areas have green zones, and connect with actually that part of the non-human species, to find out where your local food can be grown or is coming from, to, if you live in a rural or semi-rural area, to go and actually do that communing with nature thing. It's not wacky anymore. It's life-saving for ourselves and the planet. But then also, in the last thing to mention is that in nonviolent struggle, there is a dynamic called the humanizing dynamic. And so we know in war and violent conflict rely upon dehumanization of the two sides, so that then they fight each other as if one side is not human, versus depending on which side you're on. But in nonviolent struggle, we rehumanize everyone in the equation. We stop thinking of ourselves or presenting ourselves as statistics or issues. We start to be real human beings. And that has a noted transformative quality within the equation. We bring ourselves, our faces, our loves, our real humanness to the forefront of the conversation. And we make this personal, because it is. With the earth, there's something about that too. It's not about humanizing the earth so much as bringing the idea of environmental protection out of statistics and into the lived reality that we experience. And this may look very different. It's not all about fuzzy polar bear pictures, although they're totally adorable. It's sometimes about that little creek behind the school that you, your grandfather, and your kids all played in, that is about to get bulldozed so they can put in a big ditch and a pipeline, as is happening in Florida right now. So we need to raise up the visibility of the actual earth, but also the relationship of ourselves and humanity with that earth. That it's not a separate object-subject dynamic. It is a relationship of two living beings. And I think when we bring that back into how we're approaching the work that we're doing in our communities and in our movements, some magic starts to happen. We've certainly seen it in struggles around the world on environmental issues. Okay, what else, you guys? If you don't stop me, I just talk forever. Kind of like an automatic machine that way. If you'd like to share a story that inspires you, if you'd like to share a concern, if you have an idea for what more could be done, we have about 5 minutes left on this call. And I want to hear from you.
One thing I'm curious about is what actions people are thinking of taking, and any kind of groups or ways people are trying to stay connected and accountable to doing stuff.
So Nathan asks, in case yours broke up a little, Nathan asks, what types of actions are you personally doing? What ways are you staying connected to people and organizations working for change? Very specific question. Wonderful. So Durrell just posted that she'll be doing nonviolent resistance trainings throughout the state of New Mexico. I want to come to one of those, Durrell. It sounds great. Who else? Who else is engaged in doing something? I actually suspect you're engaged in doing more than you're sharing right now, because I know that we all are. Okay, well, one of the things that I am doing is also doing strategy trainings, both online and sometimes in my community. And then also as a writer, I do write quite frequently and use that as a form of social protest. You know, as I mentioned, our family is going renewable. We also, here in New Mexico, my immediate partnership tries to shop locally and stay local. I used to travel around the US quite frequently teaching, but now I tend to stay home and do more online when I can, because it does lower the carbon footprint. You know, I do try to help people connect to resistance campaigns going on in their area. And then one thing we can all do, that I do, is that I kept my eye on our local energy cooperative for several years as they stumbled through their process of being able to get renewable energy. And I'm happy to report that they are now in a position that they expect to be 100% renewable in the summer hours by 2020. So keeping your eye on your local energy source can be really powerful. If they aren't totally renewable yet, sometimes they have a renewable option that you can buy for just a little bit more on your electric bill, which is a great way to drive the change and drive the demand for change.
I have a small story to share about poop. One of our most wonderful renewable resources. So at the Eco Village, North Carolina, the house I live in when I'm there, we have a human manure recycling system where we, poop in a bucket covered with sawdust, bring it out back, compost it over a period of about a year, and then use it in the garden. And I had known about human manure for like 10 years. I'd heard about it in my permaculture class, like in 2006. And it's like, oh, that's a great idea. But I had never actually experienced it. So I immediately volunteered to help with that job, just so I could, get some hands-on experience. And one thing that happened because of that was there was the other person in the house who was in charge of the human manure at that time. We didn't really get along, but because he had to talk me through this process of dumping my first poop bucket, that we sort of bonded over that, and eventually, we had developed a good relationship. So I had the experience of doing it there. It was quite, disgusting at first. Sure, like dumping the first bucket is really hard, but then I got used to it. I came to understand it. It was like, this is not a big deal. This makes perfect sense. Then back home in New York, I'm noticing our huge sewage treatment plant, and it's like, oh, no matter how disorganized the human manure system might be, at Medicine Wheel at this house, what comes out is this beautiful, sweet smelling soil. And that is possible. So recently in our local newspaper in New York, there's an article about a small town, a little township nearby where they don't have a sewer system. They only have septics. And but the town population is growing, and they're freaking out about the cost of putting in a sewage system. So I wrote a letter to the editor of the local paper, and I said, well, it seems like a problem, but it could be an opportunity, because if you don't want to spend a whole bunch of money dealing with your excess poop, here's an idea. And I included a link to the Human Manure Handbook. And the web version of the letter, the paper included a picture of a bucket toilet. So and I also mentioned that even though it's pretty much it's illegal to do this sort of thing in New York State, if you see it as a waste management system, But if you bill it as backyard composting, it's not illegal. You're allowed to compost in your backyard. And if there's no water involved, then that's what it is. So, a little information spreading.
Thank you, Helen. I think one thing that everyone is finding is that it's on us right now. You know, someone typed in the comments that Trump is very concerning. I agree, Trump is very concerning. The plunder monkeys, as I call it, as actually I can't claim credit for it, but Stephen King, the horror writer, called them the motley crew of plunder monkeys in the cabinet positions, are concerning. We're going backwards on the national level and rapidly. But what is encouraging is that there's no more illusion. It is up to us. If we want to see change, we have to do it. We have to literally pick up the bucket in some cases, call up the solar company in other cases, get on our bike in other cases, go shop at the local farmer's market, go blockade a pipeline, go stop the local frackers, go get your alma mater to divest from fossil fuels. It's really on us. There are many strategies. They all have track records of moderate to much success, and that we can actually be that change that we're looking for. But we're going to have to be it, and we're going to have to do it now. One of the things I say in my writing work on climate change is that there is no more life as usual. This is life unusual, and we have to get ready for the adventure of a lifetime. We're living in times that are not normal, times that require us to not normalize the way we live, but rather to radically revolutionize, evolutionize the ways that we are living, the ways that we're asking our friends and families to live, the way that we're sharing ideas, the way that we are engaging in our local and broader communities. Now, I hope that you guys have gotten some good ideas from this call. I hope that you've encountered at least one new idea. And so the last question I'm going to ask, and if you haven't spoken on the call yet and you do have a microphone or you'd like to chat in the chat box, is just what is one thing from this call that you'll leave thinking about that was new or unusual that you're going to go find out more about, that you might even do in your life? One thing. So those who would like to speak about this, you can open your mic up. Those who would like to type a response can type a response. This is just the last question for today. So we have some chats coming in the chat box. I didn't know yet about the yes men, said Nina. Darrell said, maintaining connections with you and other like-minded folks without judgment. I got reminded about those valve turners. I had forgotten about those, Dan, so thank you. Patricia, Jean, Valerie, if you'd like to comment, you're invited and welcome to. Rosalind, we haven't heard from you. Even if we've heard from you, you're welcome to comment. Great, you silent wonders. The tuba and the drum from Helen. That's a great one. Jean, thank you. Reaching out more to rebuild connections, she writes. Appreciate that one. All right. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us today, for adding your comments and your stories, for being a part of the conversation, for listening, taking notes. And if you have more questions, please don't hesitate to email me. You all have my email now. And we will talk again soon. I hope you're heartened. I hope you're a little encouraged that there's many solutions and strategies. The picture is not all bleak as we would like to imagine, and that there's lots that we can do. So my email is part of the registration link that you get, but here it is again. Oops, sorry. Thank you. And with that, I'm just going to let you guys say goodbye by unmuting you all.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful time out there. Thanks for tuning in today. Bye, Patricia. Bye, Valerie. Bye, Stephen.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.